The story starts in the kind of cold, early morning silence where every breath turns into a warning. A grown man, thin, exhausted, shoulders carved by years of forced labor, stumbles through the Mississippi woods with rope burns still fresh on his wrists. Behind him, branches tremble in ways no wind could explain. Men who later told the story said his eyes looked hunted, but not by what you'd expect, because somewhere out there, padding between the trees, was a giant wolf, guard, massive, moving with the quiet certainty of something that answers to no one. And according to every surviving account, that creature wasn't stalking him. It was guarding him. What unfolded next wasn't myth. It wasn't folklore. It was a collision of cruelty, loyalty, and the kind of raw brotherhood no system of power could contain. A man punished over a single stolen egg, a master obsessed with control, and a wolf that refused to bow. This isn't just a story. It's a warning whispered through time. If stories like this hit you the way they hit me, quiet at first, then all at once, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment saying I'm here so I know who's walking into this documentary with us. Let's breathe this one in together. Samuel moved through the early mist with shoulders set like broken pillars, carrying the kind of silence men earn only after years of being told their voice belongs to someone else entirely. He kept his gaze low, not out of fear, but because a man learns early that looking up invites challenges he can't afford when his stomach has been fighting emptiness since the night before. Every step across the damp soil felt weighted, as if the earth itself held memories of men like him, tired, hungry, pushing through mornings they never chose but somehow survived anyway. Behind him, distant boots cracked dry branches, overseers beginning their rounds, but Samuel walked faster, wanting space, needing breath, needing even one moment without command biting at his heels. He reached the edge of the woods where shadows waited like old brothers guarding a secret, a line between a world that owned him and a world that tolerated him without question. The first step past that border always felt different, as if the trees accepted him, understood him, recognized a man who carried more weight inside than any rope or chain could measure. Cold air wrapped around him with the gentleness no human hand ever offered, and for a small second, Samuel let himself slow, let himself imagine he wasn't being hunted by hunger or authority. He gathered fallen branches methodically, each piece chosen with precision, because work done properly bought him minutes of peacetime away from shouts, from lash, from eyes that saw him as nothing but labor. Leaves whispered overhead, not in warning, but in welcome, as though the forest itself acknowledged him as something more than property, something with a heartbeat and a history carved from endurance. Samuel paused near an old split tree whose trunk opened like a wound, touching the scarred bark the same way men touched familiar tools, recognizing something damaged but still standing. He bent to pick another fallen branch when the forest shifted. No breeze, no bird call, just a pressure in the air that made the tiny hairs on his arms lift in silent alarm. A soft crunch behind him froze his breath, not loud, but intentional, the kind of sound made by a creature confident enough to move without hiding its presence. Samuel didn't turn immediately. Years of instinct told him stillness saves lives, especially when surrounded by trees older than any man who ever tried to own him. Slowly, he straightened, scanning the corner of his vision, catching movement broad, dark, purposefully merging from the underbrush with a patience only predators and scarred men understand. A massive wolf stepped forward, its fur tangled like storm clouds, ribs barely hidden beneath strength carved by survival. Yellow eyes locked on Samuel with a steadiness that felt almost human. The wolf didn't growl, didn't bare teeth, didn't lower its stance. Instead, it watched him with recognition, as if remembering him from a story the forest carried between its roots. Samuel swallowed hard, understanding too well that fear only fed danger, so he held himself calm. Shoulders squared, the way men do when they refuse to give another creature dominance. The wolf drew closer, slow and deliberate, circling half a step, testing Samuel's resolve without aggression, measuring him like an equal rather than prey. Samuel lowered the branch in his hand gently to the ground, offering no threat, only the quiet truth of a man too tired to pretend he mattered more than necessity allowed. Time stretched, breath held between them, until the wolf stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Samuel could hear its heavy breathing, steady and purposeful like a forged bellows. The animal's gaze flicked to Samuel's hands, noticing the old rope burns and cracked skin, and something softened in its stance, a recognition born not from pity but from shared hardship. Samuel whispered a low greeting, not a command, not a plea, just acknowledgement, and the wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, like an old soldier accepting an unspoken truce. The forest seemed to lean in around them, leaves stilling, wind holding its breath, as though this meeting belonged to something older than men, older than fear, older than cruelty. Samuel took one careful step backward, not to flee, but to prove trust, and the wolf mirrored the movement, their motions synchronized like two survivors navigating the same silent battlefield. A heavy branch snapped somewhere deeper in the woods, distant but sharp, and the wolf's ears twitched instantly, its body shifting into alert readiness without losing focus on Samuel. The animal backed toward the shadows, moving with a grace Samuel envied, disappearing with only its glowing eyes lingering a heartbeat longer before melting fully into the dark. Samuel exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding tension like a wound, then turned back toward the clearing, knowing men would soon look for him, demanding reasons he could never safely explain. He gathered the last of the firewood, but his movements felt different, calmer, heavier with meaning, as though he'd stepped into a truth meant only for men who survive by listening. When he finally left the woods, he carried more than branches. He carried a moment that would follow him, a warning or a gift, he couldn't yet tell which. But deep inside, beneath hunger, beneath fear, beneath years of being owned, something shifted, quiet, steady, dangerous, a reminder that even a bound man can be recognized by a creature that bows to no one. Jonah woke before the frost finished forming on the cabin roof, rising from his cot with the slow stiffness of a man who'd survived to many winters by sheer discipline and nothing else. Cold bit into his knuckles as he laced his boots, the kind of cold that reminded him he'd chosen a life away from towns, away from noise, away from men who tried shaping him into someone obedient. Outside, the forest waited in heavy silence, its darkness pressed tightly between the trees, a wall of shadows Jonah trusted more than he'd ever trusted uniformed men barking orders. He stepped into the bitter air, breath turning white, carrying the familiar scent of pine, damp soil, and something metallic lingering faintly, as though nearby ground remembered a struggle. Jonah adjusted the old rifle slung across his back, not because he feared animals, but because men sometimes wandered too far from the logging road searching for trouble. He walked the narrow trail toward the ridge, boots crunching frost, eyes scanning the tree line for movement, instinct sharpened by years of learning that danger rarely announces itself. Halfway up the slope, a branch snapped sharply behind him, not accidental, not whether intentional, force applied by something large enough to demand Jonah's full attention. He turned slowly, posture steady, refusing to show surprise as a towering figure stepped between two figures, a man built like stone, beard thick, eyes reflecting a strange cold fire. The stranger carried no weapon, yet his presence hit Jonah like a warning, the kind delivered by men who fought too long in places no map ever mentioned. Jonah didn't speak first. Silence was safer, silence was strategic, silence gave him the advantage of choosing who he was before the other man decided for him. The stranger raised one hand slightly, not aggressive, but decisive, a gesture that said he wasn't running, wasn't afraid, and wasn't here to negotiate weakness. "You lost?" Jonah asked finally, voice steady, each word shaped by years of speaking only when necessary, the tone men used before fists or steel made answers irrelevant. "No," the stranger replied, gaze unwavering. "I'm being followed." The statement carried weight, the kind that didn't need explanation to become dangerous. Jonah's jaw tightened, instincts shifting immediately. Men who brought trouble didn't scare him, but the idea of someone tracking a giant through dense woods meant bigger problems. He scanned the trail behind the stranger, seeing nothing but bent grass and disturbed frost, signs of movement too organized to belong to animals living free. "How many?" Jonah asked, eyes narrowing, not out of fear but calculation, already mapping the forest paths in his mind with the precision of a hunter. "3, the stranger answered, armed, moving quiet. The words fell heavy, shaped by fatigue and urgency, not panic, proving the man wasn't running, he was buying time. Jonah nodded once, decision settling over him like armor. The woods were his territory, and no armed men would force him into hiding within his own life. He motioned for the stranger to follow, leading him toward a narrow ridge overlook where the trees thinned and the ground funneled intruders into a single predictable line. They stood shoulder to shoulder, two men carved by solitude, watching the trail until distant footsteps echoed quiet, precise, filled with the confidence of trained men. Jonah steadied his breathing, every muscle settling into readiness, the stillness before conflict familiar as heartbeat, echoing the nights he once survived by instinct alone. The first pursuer emerged, a broad man with a long coat and rigid jaw, scanning the tree line with the cold patience of someone accustomed to tracking fellow men. Jonah raised a hand silently, signaling the stranger to stay low, letting him gauge patterns, listening to the rhythm of boots crunching frost at deliberate intervals. A second figure appeared, younger but equally hardened, gripping a rifle tightly, glancing toward the ridge as though sensing eyes already dissecting his presence. The third man lingered behind the others, cautious, watching shadows as though expecting the forest to move against him before any human confrontation began. Jonah felt the stranger shift beside him, tension radiating like heat, not fear but anticipation to men ready to reclaim their ground from intruders who knew nothing of this land. "On my call," Jonah whispered, voice low as smoke, a tone carrying trust without ceremony, acknowledging the stranger as an equal in conflict. As the pursuers moved beneath the ridge, Jonah rose fully, silhouette outlined against the pale sky, his stance declaring the forest defended by someone who wouldn't retreat. The stranger stood beside him, broad frame forming a wall of quiet defiance, both men poised like carved granite, daring the intruders to test their resolve. All motion below halted, as the three armed men realized they were already outmatched not by numbers, but by presence, by certainty, by two men who refused to be hunted. The cold wind shifted then, carrying nothing but breath, tension, and the promise of a confrontation that would reshape every man standing on that frost-covered trail. The three pursuers froze beneath the ridge, their boots locked in place as if the frost itself clamped around their ankles, each man realizing he'd stepped into territory owned by someone far more dangerous. Jonah didn't move, didn't flinch, letting the silence stretch long enough to carve unease into the intruder's nerves, proving presence alone could tower higher than steel or rifles. The stranger beside him inhaled slowly, broad chest rising with controlled tension, a man accustomed to conflict yet grateful to finally stand where the odds weren't stacked entirely against him. Below, the lead pursuer lifted his chin, recognizing Jonah not as a hermit, but as a man shaped by battles he'd chosen to forget, battles now resurrected by necessity. "You harboring him," the pursuer called, voice steady but tight around the edges, betraying a concern he tried burying beneath authority and practiced arrogance. Jonah stepped forward once, boots crushing frost with a sound that landed like a declaration, refusing to hide or pretend he wasn't fully invested in defending the stranger. "He's under my roof," Jonah said calmly. "That makes him under my protection." The words settled like iron, the kind that hardened long before this conflict. The second pursuer reached for his rifle, not raising it, just gripping it tighter, the subtle shift of a man preparing for escalation he couldn't fully control. Jonah shook his head slowly, telegraphing a promise rather than a threat, an unspoken warning learned by men who survived more winters than wars. "You're out of line," the lead pursuer replied, though his stance wavered, the cold biting deeper into his certainty as he studied to men refusing to retreat. The stranger's eyes hardened, anger simmering behind exhaustion, not the wild kind but the quiet controlled fury that grows when men are hunted beyond reason. He stepped forward, matching Jonah's position, shoulders squared, making it clear this fight wouldn't be one-sided, wouldn't be clean, wouldn't be easy for anyone approaching. "We don't want bloodshed," the cautious pursuer said from the back, though his trembling breath revealed he believed it was already too late for calm negotiations. Jonah noted the shift instantly, reading the man's fear like weather patterns, knowing fear predicts danger far more accurately than courage ever could. "You shouldn't have followed him here," Jonah answered, firm but measured, conveying more judgment than hostility, drawing all three pursuers deeper into doubt. The lead pursuer's jaw clenched, stubbornness outweighing caution as he stepped closer, trying to reassert dominance he'd carried on countless other hunts. Jonah raised his hand sharply, halting the movement with nothing but presence, a command forged from experience rather than authority. "You crossed that line," Jonah warned, "and you won't leave these woods the same man who entered." Every syllable carried the weight of earned truth. The stranger's voice joined his, deep and steady, offering no explanation for why he'd been hunted, only conviction that this confrontation was unnecessary but unavoidable. "I left your camp because I wouldn't follow your orders anymore," he said, directing his words toward the lead pursuer. "I won't bow to a man who lost his own compass." The pursuer stiffened, wounded by truth more than rebellion, because nothing injures a leader faster than being exposed by someone he once commanded. "You deserted," the pursuer snapped, but his anger cracked at the edges, sounding more like a man who'd lost control than one who upheld principle. "I walked away," the stranger replied. "There's a difference." His tone cut cleanly through the icy air, sparking a visible shift in the silent forest around them. For a moment, no one breathed deeply. The confrontation balanced on a fragile thread woven from pride, exhaustion, and two men standing resolute atop the ridge. Jonah kept his focus on their hands, waiting for the telltale twitch of a rifle stock or the quick panic of a misjudged reaction, his mind analyzing every second. Then the cautious pursuer stepped back, breaking formation, clearly unwilling to die on frozen ground over another man's wounded pride and abandoned authority. The younger pursuer looked between Jonah and his former ally, understanding survival demanded retreat, not confrontation, especially against men who'd already claimed the terrain. Finally, the lead pursuer exhaled, defeated by the silent truth of the woods itself, shoulders slumping with the weight of a battle lost long before it began. "We'll leave," he muttered, forcing dignity into his steps despite the unmistakable tremor in his voice. But this isn't finished. Jonah stepped closer to the ridge edge, letting his shadow fall across the trail, answering with a stare rather than words, a message carved directly into the cold air. The pursuers retreated, footsteps fading slowly, swallowed by the forest, leaving Jonah and the stranger alone beneath the rising pale morning light. Jonah waited until the last footstep disappeared, letting the woods reclaim silence, the kind that settles heavy on a man's shoulders after danger passes but leaves its shadow behind. The stranger remained beside him, chest rising with slow controlled breaths, not relief but recalibration, the way seasoned men adjust after surviving conflict without swinging a single punch. Frost loosened under the growing light, tiny crystals cracking softly, echoing the tension easing from both men's bodies as the forest shifted back into its natural rhythm. Jonah turned first, heading down the ridge path with a deliberate pace, expecting the stranger to follow without needing instruction or spoken agreement. The stranger's boots crunched behind him, steady and strong, a rhythm Jonah immediately trusted, the cadence of a man who knew how to move without asking permission. They reached Jonah's cabin, smoke from the dying fire curling into the cold air, carrying hints of pine resin and embers still clinging to life beneath gray ash. Jonah pushed open the wooden door, stepping aside so the stranger could enter, offering hospitality through gesture alone, the language men use when words feel unnecessary. Inside, the single lantern glowed dimly, casting long shadows across rough-hewn walls and the small table scarred from years of practical living. The stranger lowered himself onto the nearest stool, posture steady but drained, the exhaustion of constant flight settling into his bones now that he'd found a moment of safety. Jonah set water to boil over the stove, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd lived alone long enough to make silence feel like a companion. Steam rose slowly, filling the room with warmth that softened the hard edges of the morning's tension, giving both men a rare moment to breathe without expectation. The stranger finally spoke, voice lower now, shaped by truth rather than defensiveness, saying he left the camp because the leader demanded obedience without honor. Jonah nodded once, recognizing the kind of betrayal described, a rift born not from rebellion but from refusing to let another man bend him into something lesser. He wanted loyalty without giving it, the stranger said, staring at the lantern flame, eyes reflecting memories that weighed heavy on his broad shoulders. Jonah poured hot water into 2 tin cups, placing one in front of the stranger, the simple act carrying the significance of shared ground between equal men. "He followed you because men like that can't stand losing control," Jonah replied, tone even, shaped by experience living far from men who worship authority. The stranger accepted the cup, fingers brushing warm metal, his face shifting with quiet gratitude, the rare kind given by a man who trusts sparingly. Outside, the forest echoed with distant groans of shifting branches, the world continuing without concern for the turmoil men brought into it. Jonah leaned against the wall, studying the stranger with calm scrutiny, not judgment, measuring the depth of resolve in the man he'd just defended. "You staying?" Jonah asked finally, not as a question seeking permission but as a confirmation of intent, the way veterans understand each other without ceremony. For a while, the stranger replied, steady tone matching the room's stillness, acknowledging he needed time, rest, and space free from men carrying rifles and grudges. Jonah pushed a crate toward the corner, clearing a space near the stove where the stranger could sleep, practical evidence that the cabin now held 2 men instead of 1. The stranger stood, stretching his shoulders, muscles stiff from days of running, his movements revealing resilience forged from hardship rather than training. He removed his coat, hanging it on a nail by the door, the simple gesture marking acceptance, a silent admission that he trusted this place enough to lower his guard. Jonah stepped outside to gather more firewood, cold air brushing against his face, carrying hints of pine and something unfamiliar, a feeling close to kinship. When he returned, the stranger was tending the fire, feeding it carefully, proving he understood the unspoken rule that shared spaces require shared hands. Flames strengthened, filling the cabin with deeper warmth, the kind that settles quietly into a man's chest when he realizes he no longer stands alone. Jonah sat across from him, both men warmed by the fire and the strange comfort of coexistence, a bond forming from nothing more than survival and respect. The stranger spoke again, promising he wouldn't bring further danger to the cabin, a vow made with sincerity that carried the weight of a man's word. Jonah accepted the vow with a nod, knowing trust between men doesn't require dramatic declarations, only consistency and presence when storms threatened to return. Night fell slowly, shadows thickening around the cabin, but inside, the air felt lighter than morning, as though the forest itself approved of the alliance forged. Two men scarred, stubborn, unbroken sat by the fire, not speaking, not planning, simply existing side by side in the quiet they'd earned together.